Amid grand tales of oil, gas, and semiconductor chips, there lies a seemingly small story that quietly carries heavy geopolitical weight: the potato. Just golden tubers sprouting from the red soil of Prince Edward Island or the plains of Saskatchewan, yet once they cross the border, they become part of the closest knit trade flow in North America. In countless diners across the Midwest, from produce trucks rumbling overnight to cold storage warehouses in Maine, from the crispy fries on an American family's dinner table to the trays of mashed potatoes in school cafeterias, Canadian potatoes had once been so familiar that no one could imagine them disappearing. And yet, on an April morning in 2025, Washington quietly signed a decision: a 35% tariff on all potatoes imported from Canada. No press conference, no diplomatic statement, not even a lengthy explanation, just a few dry lines in an administrative document. And then everything changed almost instantly. The price of a $22 bag of potatoes shot up to $30. A side of fries that used to cost $3.50 now became $5.25. Americans began to notice the fries on their plates were softer, chewier, and discolored faster. Across the border, the once bustling cold storage warehouses of Prince Edward Island grew quieter. The potato trucks bound for the U.S. vanished, as if someone had flipped a switch. There were no loud protests, no declarations of retaliation, only a cold, stony silence. And it was precisely that silence that made the story heavier, like a breakup where one side simply turns away, not slamming the door, but leaving a void the other cannot immediately fill. What makes this incident remarkable isn't just its economic impact, but the deeper political message it carries. This is no longer a story about mere agricultural goods. It's a strike at the heart of trust in trade relations. When a close partner chooses to act abruptly, without warning, it doesn't just disrupt supply chains, it plants in the minds of everyone involved a troubling question: was this long-standing bond only temporary, and could it be severed at any moment if politics demands it? To fully grasp the weight of this decision, we must look back at the journey that brought Canadian potatoes to become an essential part of the American meal. This was never a casual trade arrangement. It was the product of decades of building, stability, and trust, until that shock came. For decades, among the countless goods moving back and forth across the world's longest trading bridge, Canadian potatoes have held a special place: quiet, uncontroversial, yet steady as a heartbeat. From the sweeping fields of Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick to the cold, dry farms of Manitoba, truckload after truckload of potatoes crossed the border into America's northern states, feeding a vast market. In 2024, that figure reached 350,000 tons, the equivalent of hundreds of millions of servings, making their way onto the tables of over 17 million American households. What's fascinating is that this was more than an economic exchange. It had become a kind of ritual between the two nations. Just as Canada imported crude oil from the U.S. Imported potatoes from Canada, a natural complement, with each side relying on the other's strengths to balance out seasons, climates, and consumption needs. When winter froze the fields of Maine, refrigerated trucks from Canada crossed the border, delivering fresh potatoes to warehouses. When Canada's summer turned hot and dry, processors there received potatoes from U.S. reserves. This supply chain stood strong not just because of geography, but thanks to a meticulously built logistics network. Shared inspection stations, cross-border highways, long-term contracts between farmers and major food processing companies. It was a system both sides trusted, not only for its economic benefits, but because it had proven its ability to withstand swings in weather, market shifts, and even other trade disputes. That's why the shock of April 2025 was so hard to believe. A steady flow that had lasted for decades, seemingly untouchable, could be shut down with a single signature. No lobbying campaigns, no adjustment period. Washington needed only minutes to turn a model trade relationship into a tense test. And Canada's response, not loud, not publicly angry, only made the moment stranger. Because what followed wasn't a war of words, nor the tit-for-tat retaliation so common in global trade. Instead, Canada chose silence, stepping back from the US market as if it had never been there. It wasn't surrender, but a form of soft resistance, what observers later came to call trade ghosting. When the first headlines about the 35% tariff appeared, many assumed it was just a symbolic move from Washington, a political boost for the America First slogan during election season. But in truth, it was a calculated decision aimed squarely at rural voters, the ones who believe that protecting domestic farmers is protecting the very heart of America. There were no bilateral negotiations, no transition period for businesses to adjust. Overnight, contracts that had been running smoothly suddenly became cost burdens. Each 25-ton container of potatoes shipped from Canada to the US now carried an extra $11,200 in taxes. That pushed retail prices in supermarkets and restaurants up sharply, an average of 35% in just a matter of weeks. American suppliers scrambled to fill the gap, but differences in potato varieties, climate, and storage techniques meant the quality could hardly match what came before. Restaurant owners noticed quickly, but instead of openly protesting the policy, they quietly altered menus, reduced portion sizes, and hoped customers wouldn't notice too much. Across the border, Canada faced a choice: retaliate immediately with tariffs on American goods, the usual rhythm of global trade, or take another path. Ottawa chose the other path. No fiery press conferences, no sharp public jabs, no threats. They simply stopped. Potato shipments halted, contracts were canceled, and the U.S. market was left empty. Analysts later called it trade ghosting, a soft form of retaliation with lasting weight. When you disappear from a partner's market without triggering a direct confrontation, you deny them the chance to play the victim card and rally political support. Instead, you let the absence speak for itself. Without Canadian potatoes, American customers would compare, remember the taste, and notice the difference every time they picked up a fry. It's a slow, steady kind of pressure that campaign rhetoric can't easily erase. The Canadian government understood that in trade, the hardest hit doesn't always come from loud, forceful action. Sometimes, a quiet withdrawal is the sharpest message. If you treat me with disregard, I will walk away, and you'll have to learn to live with that loss. But such a decision didn't just create a political ripple. It set off immediate, tangible changes on both sides of the border, from small kitchens in Iowa to cold storage warehouses in New Brunswick. And it was there that the real consequences began to surface. In the US, the first effects appeared within the very week the tariff took effect. In small Midwest diners, owners were forced to cut back fry portions or switch to cheaper, lower-quality potatoes. Customers noticed the difference after just one or two meals: softer fries that browned too quickly and tasted blander. Some began complaining on social media, posting side-by-side comparisons of Canada's golden, crisp, firm potatoes against the less appealing new variety. Larger restaurants tried masking the change with loaded fries or heavy toppings, but to discerning diners the flavor was irreplaceable. According to data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, in just one quarter, the average price of a serving of fries jumped from $3.50 to $5.25. Customer satisfaction surveys recorded a 10 to 18% drop in perceived quality for potato-based menu items. States that had relied heavily on Canadian potatoes, Minnesota, Michigan, New York, saw restaurant revenues dip slightly, partly because customers shifted to other choices. Across the border, once busy cold storage warehouses in Canada fell silent. Export contracts shortened or were outright canceled. Many farmers had to cut planting areas by 15 to 25% to avoid surplus stock. Some potatoes were redirected to the domestic market, driving prices down for local consumers. Others, especially the uglier varieties that had struggled to compete in the U.S., were channeled into food bank programs, feeding hundreds of thousands of low-income families. This inadvertently gave Canada a political image boost, turning a trade crisis into an opportunity to showcase humanitarian politics. But in the long run, this was not sustainable. Canada's logistics infrastructure and domestic market could not absorb the entire volume once destined for America's vast appetite. Food processors began to worry, and cooperatives started scouting for new markets. The contrast was stark. America wrestled with maintaining the quality and price of a beloved staple, while Canada sought to break free from dependence on a single massive buyer. This rupture was more than an economic hit. It was a reminder that even the closest trade relationships can falter when politics intrudes. From that realization, Ottawa launched a new strategy: not waiting for the US to change, but charting a course around it. Instead of knocking again on a closed door, they chose to open many others, turning their sights toward Asia. Ottawa understood that standing still and waiting for political winds to shift in Washington would only leave the potato industry trapped in a reactive position. So when the American door closed, they pivoted, not with grand proclamations, but through a quiet yet determined series of moves. Signing agreements, negotiating terms, running trials, and expanding outreach. Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and even several Caribbean nations quickly appeared on the list of potential partners. These markets, though varied in tastes and standards, shared one common trait: a willingness to pay premium prices for high-quality produce, especially when grown under Canada's strict food safety regulations. From Japanese convenience store chains to Korean restaurants, from Phuket's beachfront resorts to Bali's tourist hubs, Canadian potatoes began to appear, modest in volume at first, but steadily finding their place. What stood out was that Ottawa wasn't only targeting the perfect-looking potatoes that had dominated the US market. They also sought outlets for Grade 2 potatoes, those less visually perfect but still excellent in quality and flavor. In many Asian countries, these could be turned into snacks, soups, or mashed into ingredients for street food dishes. This approach eased storage pressures and maximized production value. Of course, the new path was not without thorns. Logistics costs rose by 20 to 35% due to longer distances and stricter preservation requirements. In some Asian countries, sluggish quarantine procedures left shipments idling at ports for days. Not every market accepted fresh potatoes, forcing Canadian producers to invest in processing and packaging technologies. But geopolitically, it was a smart play. By widening its network of buyers, Canada reduced the risk of becoming a trade hostage whenever the US chose to wield tariffs as leverage. A presence in multiple markets also gave Canada's potato industry greater bargaining power, not just with America, but in multilateral trade agreements as well. One could debate the short-term economic payoff of this strategy, but it's hard to deny one truth. The pivot to Asia sent a clear message that Canada was willing to shed its dependence, even at an immediate cost. And that message, on closer look, went far beyond the story of potatoes. From what seemed like mere lifeless tubers, the story quietly evolved into a test of trust and conduct in international trade. When a close partner like the United States chooses to impose tariffs suddenly, without warning, without negotiation, the first thing damaged isn't profit, but the trust built over decades. Trade isn't just about numbers and contracts. It's a web of relationships where promises and respect can matter more than any tariff rate or price tag. Canada understood this, and instead of reacting loudly, they let the absence speak for itself. No accusations, no tit-for-tat exchanges, just a withdrawal and a shift of focus toward other partners. It was a form of soft power, not a direct strike, but one that forces the other side to face the consequences of its own actions. This wasn't merely a tactical reaction, but a political message. If you treat me with disrespect, I will walk away, and I will find a way to no longer need you. A report from the U.S. Produce Association, USPA, spelled it out plainly. In the short term, protectionism may yield political gains, but reputational damage is far harder to repair. Policymakers in Washington surely understood this. Yet in the churn of election politics, short-term benefits often trump long-term vision. And as the absence of Canadian potatoes began to affect the quality and consumption habits of millions of Americans, Ottawa's message became impossible to ignore. The history of US-Canada relations has seen its share of clashes over softwood lumber, dairy, aluminum, and steel. Each time, a new scar was left behind. This time, potatoes were no exception, but the difference lay in how Canada chose to respond. Without grandiose statements, they still made the entire US market remember them. Not through presence, but through absence. Seen more broadly, it's a lesson for any nation overly dependent on a single market. That dependency is like living in a house where someone else holds the keys. If they change the lock, you're suddenly left outside. By pivoting toward Asia, Canada signaled they would not allow themselves to be caught off guard like that again. The potato story, then, is not just about an agricultural product. It's proof that in trade, respect and trust are the most valuable assets of all. Once lost, regaining them can require far more than a favorable contract or a diplomatic apology. And that's when people realize, even from a single potato, deep political lessons can sprout, reaching down to the very roots of relations between nations. In the end, looking back at the entire story, we can see this wasn't just a fleeting trade dispute. It was a quiet breakup with a long echo. Canada chose to step away without fanfare, letting the absence speak for itself. The US was left facing fries that were less tasty, more expensive, and a once stable market now unsettled. Both sides, whether they liked it or not, had to adapt. The question now is, if one day Washington decides to lift the 35% tariff, will Canada return to the US market as before? Or have they already found a more sustainable path, one where Asia and other markets become indispensable partners? The answer may depend on whether trust can be restored, and in trade, that can sometimes be even harder than signing a new contract. This lesson isn't just for Canada or the US, but for any nation that leans too heavily on a single market. When you let your economy rest on one pillar alone, you place your fate in someone else's hands. And when that pillar shakes, the fall can be brutal. Diversifying markets, strengthening logistics, infrastructure, and above all, building relationships grounded in mutual respect. That is the only way to stand firm against unpredictable shocks. From a single potato, we can see that international trade isn't always about massive industries or billion-dollar investments. Sometimes the simplest products reveal the clearest truths: power, trust, and the way nations treat one another. And now, I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think of Canada's choice? Was it a smart strategic move or just a momentary reaction to a political shock? Share your opinion in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring the trade politics stories that are shaping our world, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, because stories like this will be back in ways you might not expect.